He'd lost everything: his unit, his wife, and 3 years of his life stolen by lies. Standing before the rusted gates of a lonely beach house, Elias was just a ghost of the commander he once was. But the moment they stepped inside, Scout froze, growling at an ordinary-looking wall. What Elias found hidden there would uncover a conspiracy no one was ready for. The secret his late wife died to protect will break your heart. But the bond between this veteran and his dog will restore your faith in justice. Justice may be delayed, but never forgotten. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and subscribe for more stories of loyalty. A low Maine fog clung to the iron gates of Riverside Medical Center, smelling of salt and industrial antiseptic. The sky was a bruised purple, weeping a fine, cold mist that blurred the line between the sea and the sky, mirroring the fractured state of the man standing on the threshold. Elias stood motionless as the heavy iron gates groaned shut behind him, a sound that resonated in his chest like the closing of a tomb he had occupied for 3 long years. At 45, he remained a man of striking, albeit rugged, physical presence. His frame was lean and hardened by years of elite service, though his hazel eyes now carried a profound, searching emptiness that the military doctors had labeled as permanent trauma. His hair, once a solid chestnut, was now streaked with silver at the temples, and a thin, neatly groomed beard, also flecked with silver, contoured the sharp, weathered angles of a face that had seen too much of the world's darkness. He was dressed simply for his release, a beige canvas field jacket worn over a crisp, beige button-up shirt, and solid dark charcoal chino pants that broke perfectly over his worn brown boots. There was no denim, no jeans, and certainly no red on his clothing, a stark utilitarian palette that made him appear as though he were trying to blend into the very fog that surrounded him. In his right hand, he gripped the only piece of his past they had allowed him to keep, a single heavily rusted iron key to Tidcrest, a beach house he had not seen since the world collapsed 3 years ago. His mind felt like a mosaic with missing pieces. The doctors had called his stay treatment, but Elias felt it was an attempt at erasure, a systematic scrubbing of a commander who knew too much about a project that shouldn't exist. As he stepped onto the cracked pavement, a low, rhythmic thumping hit the ground, followed by a soft, familiar whimper that shattered the institutional silence. Scout, a majestic German shepherd with a thick sable coat and a prominent black saddle, surged forward from the shadows of a parked vehicle. The dog was a creature of pure, disciplined power, his amber eyes glowing with a recognition that defied the 1,095 days of their separation. He wore no vest, no harness of service, just the raw dignity of his breed. Scout did not bark. He simply pressed the weight of his large, warm body against Elias's charcoal chinos, a grounding force that Elias felt in his very marrow. For 3 years, while Elias had been trapped behind sterile walls, Scout had lived a life of patient vigil. He had been cared for by Margaret, an elderly neighbor, but the dog's heart had never left the gates of Riverside. Every Saturday morning, without fail, Scout would walk the 5 miles from the coast to sit before these iron gates, his nose pressed to the cold metal as he inhaled the faint, disappearing scent of the man who had raised him. He was more than a pet. He was a partner, a silent witness to the commander Elias used to be, and the only soul who truly understood the cost of the promise they had both made to a woman who was no longer there. Standing near a battered pickup truck was Margaret Brennan, her silver hair pulled back into a practical, neat bun that revealed a face lined by 7 decades of sea wind and salt. She was a woman carved from the rugged Maine coastline, patient, observant, and possessed of a quiet strength that emanated from her pale blue eyes. Margaret had known Elias's wife, Sarah, and she was the only one who suspected that Elias's medical leave was a facade for something far more sinister. She stepped forward, her sturdy shoes crunching on the gravel, and placed a weathered hand on Elias's arm. "He never stopped coming for you, Elias," she whispered, her voice a soft rasp that carried the warmth of a wood fire. Elias looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the hazel of his eyes sparked with a recognition of the life he had lost. He thanked her with a nod, the words catching in his throat. And as he climbed into the truck with Scout, the weight of the rusted key in his pocket felt like a leaden anchor, pulling him toward a home that was now a ghost of its former self. As the truck moved north, the landscape shifted to the wild, untamed beauty of the coast, triggering fragments of Sarah. She had been a neurologist, a woman of profound intellect and a beauty that was as gentle as a morning tide. Elias remembered her dark hair, always smelling of lavender and roses, and the way her brown eyes would sparkle when she laughed. She was tall and slender, her skin always holding a faint warmth, and when she smiled, a small dimple would appear in the left corner of her mouth. She had been the heart of Tidcrest, the one who had discovered the breath of the stones on the cliffs where she believed healing began. Sarah had been more than a wife. She was the architect of his peace, the one who had warned him about the darkness growing within the military's research wings before she was silenced. The truck slowed as they reached Tidcrest House, perched on a rocky promontory. It was a sight that made Elias's breath catch. A 2-story white wooden house, now decaying and surrendered to the elements. Ivy and vines crawled up the peeling white siding, and the roof was damaged, with shingles scattered across the yard, like broken teeth. The isolation was absolute. The house sat surrounded by crashing waves on 3 sides. Elias stepped out, the salt air hitting his face with a sharp, bracing cold. Scout immediately began to roam the perimeter, his sable fur bristling as he sniffed the overgrown grass. The dog's tail was low, his amber eyes scanning the broken windows with a tactical precision that mirrored Elias's own internal alarm. This was not the home Elias had left. It was a ruin, a monument to a life interrupted. Elias walked slowly toward a large rock near the base of the porch, his eyes drawn to a small, hand-painted orange starfish that was half buried in the sand. He reached down and brushed the sand away, the texture of the stone rough against his fingers. Beneath the rock, he saw a faint, deliberate etching. U.S. Signal Corps, 1944. A mark that didn't belong on a civilian house. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just left him a home. She had left him a map. He turned the rusted key in the lock, and despite the years of neglect, the mechanism turned with a smooth, oiled silence that made his blood run cold. Someone had been here. Someone had been maintaining the locks while he was rotting in a ward. As the door swung inward to reveal a dark hallway, Scout stepped inside first, a low, protective growl vibrating in his throat. Elias followed, knowing that the promise of 1,095 days was about to be tested by a truth that would either set him free or destroy what little remained of his soul. The heavy oak door of Tidcrest clicked shut with a finality that seemed to sever Elias from the rest of the world, leaving him anchored in a thick, suffocating silence. Inside, the air was a stagnant brew of salt rot, ancient dust, and a faint metallic tang that smelled of abandoned machinery and long-forgotten secrets. Elias stood in the shadows of the foyer, his hands still resting on the cold brass knob, as the twilight filtered through the grime-streaked windows. He felt the crushing weight of the 3 years stolen from him. 1,095 days of white walls and soft-spoken lies designed to erode his will. For a long moment, the commander within him remained dormant, buried under the layers of psychological conditioning he had endured at Riverside. He looked at the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of dying light and felt a dangerous urge to simply sit in the darkness and let the house consume him. His hazel eyes, once capable of tracking a target through a desert sandstorm, were clouded with a weary resignation, and the rusted key in his palm felt like a leaden anchor, pulling him toward a final, silent surrender. But Scout had no intention of letting the darkness win. The German Shepherd moved through the house with a tactical, predatory grace that ignored the aesthetic decay. He was a creature of pure instinct and elite training, his sable fur bristling against the peeling Victorian wallpaper as he patrolled the perimeter of the living room. Scout didn't sniff for food or comfort. He scanned for anomalies. Suddenly, the dog froze near a colonial-style mahogany baseboard beside the fireplace, his amber eyes narrowing into slits of golden fire. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest, a sound that Elias recognized from a dozen battlefield perimeters. Scout began to scratch at the wood with a frantic but purposeful precision. his claws digging into the ancient varnish until the sound of splintering timber cut through Elias's lethargy. The dog wasn't just agitated, he was identifying a breach in their security. It was the spark Elias needed. The fog in his mind cleared, replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of a man who had spent his life detecting traps. Elias knelt beside the dog, his beige canvas jacket straining against his broad shoulders as he reached for the damaged baseboard. With a sharp practice tug, he pried a section of the molding loose, expecting to find nothing but termite dust. Instead, he found a masterpiece of modern espionage, a microtransmitter no larger than a grain of rice, nestled in a newly drilled cavity behind the wood. The device pulsed with a faint, almost invisible infrared light, its presence a jarring violation of the house's historical ruin. Elias stared at it, his jaw tightening as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't free. He had merely been moved to a smaller, more transparent cage. Carver's medical leave was a lie. This house was a live laboratory, and he was the subject under the microscope. The beige shirt he wore felt suddenly like a target, and the charcoal chinos felt like the uniform of a prisoner once again. A sharp, rhythmic knock at the front door shattered the tension. Scout moved to the hallway in a blur of shadow, his body coiled like a high-tension spring. Elias stood, his hand resting instinctively on Scout's head to hold him back, as he opened the door to reveal a young man standing on the porch. Samuel "Sammy" Reed was a lean, wiry youth in his early 20s, with a shock of messy blonde hair that looked as though it had never known a comb. He wore a faded local hardware store vest over a stained hoodie, his skin pale and peppered with light freckles across a nervous, narrow face. Sammy was a local boy, the grandson of a retired lighthouse keeper, and he carried a small box of basic groceries, a peace offering from Margaret. He possessed a jittery, wide-eyed energy, his gaze constantly darting toward the massive German shepherd standing guard. Sammy had a natural, albeit clumsy, curiosity for electronics, a trait inherited from a family of radio hobbyists, and he seemed to vibrate with the unspoken gossip of the town. "Mrs. Brennan sent these over," Sammy stammered, his voice cracking as he avoided eye contact with the dog. "She said you'd be needing more than just salt air to get through the night." Elias took the box, his movement stiff and formal. "Thank you, Samuel," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to startle the boy. Sammy glanced over Elias's shoulder, his eyes lingering for a second too long on the pried-open baseboard in the hallway. "That's a hell of a dog you got there, sir," Sammy whispered, shifting his weight. "My granddad used to say this house had ears. Just old sea stories, I guess, but if you need help with the wiring, I'm the one they call." The boy turned and practically jogged back to his moped, the sound of the small engine fading into the roar of the surf, leaving Elias with a new, nagging suspicion that even the innocents of Saltmere Cove were part of the web. The encounter with Sammy acted as a catalyst. Elias realized that the psychological conditioning at Riverside had been designed to make him passive, a shell of a man who would accept the silence of Tidcrest as peace. But with Scout's amber eyes watching him, the commander reclaimed his soul. He began a methodical, tactical sweep of the house, using Scout as a living sonar. They worked as a unit, a silent dance they had performed in a dozen war zones. Elias followed the tilt of Scout's ears and the subtle tensing of his sable fur. Whenever the dog's head moved toward a light socket or a ceiling fan, Elias dismantled the object with surgical precision. By the time the moon had risen over the Atlantic, Elias had a pile of 7 microbugs sitting on the kitchen table, each one a silent witness to Carver's betrayal. He didn't stop at the obvious. He led Scout toward the kitchen, where the old U.S. Signal Corps 1944 etching sat in the foundation. Scout bypassed the modern cabinets and went straight to a heavy cast-iron stove that looked as though it hadn't been moved in decades. The dog began to paw at the floorboards beneath the stove's heavy legs. Elias knelt, his beige canvas jacket damp with sweat, and used a pry bar to lift the heavy timber. Beneath the floorboards lay a central hub, a sleek black box that consolidated the signals from the various bugs and transmitted them via satellite. The realization was chilling. Carver wasn't just listening, he was collecting data in real time, waiting for Elias to trip over a memory that was still locked away in his fractured mind. Elias sat on the cold floor, his hand resting on Scout's warm flank, and began to think like a strategist. If he destroyed the hub, Carver would know the trap was discovered and send a more direct threat. If he left them, he remained a puppet. But there was a third option. He looked at the black box and remembered Sarah's dimpled smile and her warning about the electronic ghosts that would haunt their future. She hadn't just warned him, she had prepared him. He realized that the signal core heritage of the house meant the walls were likely lined with copper mesh to prevent signal leakage, a feature he could use to his advantage. He could create a feedback loop, feeding Carver exactly what he wanted to hear, while Elias began his own investigation in the shadows. As the night deepened, Elias found himself standing at the window, looking out at the dark, churning Atlantic. He was no longer the broken man who had walked through the gates of Riverside that morning. The beige canvas jacket felt like armor, and the dark charcoal chinos felt like a uniform. Scout stood beside him, his amber eyes reflecting the silver moonlight. A silent sentinel that had never lost faith in his commander. The medical treatment had failed. They had tried to erase Elias, but in doing so, they had only sharpened the focus of the man who remained. The house was a trap, but it was also a fortress, and for the first time in 3 years, Elias knew exactly what he had to do. He took the 7 microbugs and placed them inside an old lead-lined tea tin he found in Sarah's pantry, effectively silencing them without triggering an alarm. He looked at Scout and gave a single sharp nod, the command for secure perimeter. The dog settled into a defensive position by the door, his ears twitching at every sound of the wind. Elias picked up the rusted key and walked toward the basement stairs, where the U.S. Signal Corps mark waited in the dark. The ghosts of 1944 were about to meet the ghosts of the present, and Elias was finally ready to face them both. The morning in Saltmere Cove arrived not with a sunrise, but with a thickening of the white veil that drifted off the Atlantic, turning the coastal village into a collection of jagged shapes and muffled sounds. Elias stepped out of the shadow of Tidcrest, his beige canvas field jacket buttoned against the biting humidity, and his dark charcoal chinos already damp from the high grass path. Beside him, Scout moved with a silent, measured pace, his sable fur glistening with tiny beads of dew, and his amber eyes scanning the swirling mist for more than just physical threats. Elias needed supplies, provisions that Sarah's pantry could no longer provide. But more than that, he needed to gauge the temperature of the town he had once called home. He felt the weight of the 7 microbugs sitting in the lead-lined tin back at the house, a reminder that the silence of the cove was a curated lie maintained by General Carver. As they entered the village limits, the atmosphere shifted. The rhythmic clinking of buoy bells and the distant hum of lobster boat engines were familiar. Yet the human element had grown cold. Faces that once offered a nod of recognition now turned away, eyes sliding toward the ground or the gray horizon. Carver had been busy during Elias's 1,095-day absence. The rumors had been planted like invasive weeds, stories of a commander who had broken under pressure, a man whose instability had cost the lives of his men and driven his wife to despair. The center of Saltmere Cove was dominated by Thorne's Marine Supplies, a weathered building that smelled of tar, diesel, and old iron. Standing on the porch was Silas Thorne, a man who seemed to be built from the very granite that lined the Maine coast. At 62, Silas was a towering figure of broad shoulders and a barrel chest, his skin the color of tanned leather, and his hair a wild, windswept mane of salt and pepper gray. He possessed eyes like cold flint, narrow and suspicious, and hands that were massive and calloused, permanently stained by the grease of 1,000 engines. Silas was the town's unofficial gatekeeper, a man whose family had patrolled these waters since the days of the Signal Corps bunkers, and his silence was more influential than most men's shouting. As Elias approached, Scout's ears swiveled back, sensing the wall of hostility radiating from the porch. Silas didn't move. He simply leaned against a stack of lobster traps, his gaze fixed on Elias's beige jacket, as if he could see the Riverside medical ghost still clinging to the fabric. "Markets close to those who can't keep their own house in order, Elias," Silas rasped, his voice like the grinding of pebbles in a receding tide. The rejection was sharp and communal, a coordinated shunning that left Elias standing in the center of the street. The unstable veteran archetype Carver had crafted now, manifesting in the physical world. The pressure began as a dull thrumming at the base of Elias's skull, a familiar herald of the darkness he had fought to suppress for 3 long years. He tried to focus on the salt air, on the grounding weight of his boots on the pavement, but the world began to fracture. The fog around him suddenly transformed. It was no longer Maine mist, but the thick, acrid smoke of a burning transport vehicle. The muffled sounds of the village were replaced by the staccato rhythm of gunfire and the desperate, distorted voices of his unit calling out through the static of a broken radio. Elias felt his throat constrict, his lungs seizing as if the very air had turned to liquid lead. He was no longer in Saltmere Cove. He was back in the ward, back in the final night with Sarah, the memory of her scream clawing at the walls of his mind. He staggered, his knees buckling, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that sounded like a dying man's rattle. The panic was an ocean, and he was sinking rapidly into the depths of a past that Carver had weaponized against him. Scout reacted before Elias's knees hit the gravel. The German shepherd didn't bark. He didn't whine. He moved with the calculated efficiency of a medical asset, slipping his large, sable body beneath Elias's collapsing frame to break the fall. As Elias slumped against a weathered stone wall near the harbor's edge, Scout immediately initiated deep pressure therapy. The dog climbed onto Elias's lap and pressed the full weight of his warm, solid chest against Elias's sternum. It was a technique they had perfected in the quiet hours of the night before the world broke. A physical intervention designed to override the nervous system's haywire signals. Scout's amber eyes remained locked on Elias's hazel ones, his steady, rhythmic breathing providing a biological metronome for Elias to follow. The dog's chin rested heavily on Elias's shoulder, his warmth seeping through the beige canvas jacket, acting as a living anchor in the storm of trauma. Slowly, the smoke of the flashback cleared. The gunfire faded into the gentle lapping of the tide against the pier. The liquid lead in Elias's lungs crystallized back into the cold, bracing air of the Maine coast. From the shadows of a nearby bait shed, a girl watched the scene with wide, unblinking eyes. Lily Thorne, Silas's 14-year-old granddaughter, was a slight, ethereal creature with hair the color of pale straw and skin so translucent it looked like fine porcelain. She was known as the quiet one in the village, a girl who spent her days sketching the birds on the cliffs and spoke so rarely that many thought her mute. She wore an oversized yellow raincoat that swallowed her small frame, and she held a sketchbook gripped tightly to her chest. Unlike the adults, there was no hostility in Lily's gaze, only a profound, piercing curiosity. She had seen the way the dog worked, the way the animal had reached into the man's soul to pull him back from the edge. To Lily, who lived in a world of silence and observation, the bond between the veteran and the German shepherd was the only honest thing she had seen in Saltmere Cove in years. She took a tentative step forward, her small boots silent on the damp ground, before the harsh voice of Silas called her back into the shadows of the store. Elias sat on the ground for a long time, his hand buried deep in Scout's thick sable fur, feeling the rhythmic thump of the dog's heart against his own. The villagers who had been watching from behind curtains and shop windows slowly returned to their tasks, but the air had changed. They had witnessed a vulnerability that didn't match Carver's dangerous narrative. They had seen a man saved by the loyalty of a creature that knew him better than they did. Elias stood up slowly, his movements deliberate as he adjusted his beige jacket and wiped the grit from his charcoal chinos. He looked toward Thorne's marine supplies, meeting Silas's flinty gaze with a newfound resolve. Carver could control the rumors and he could control the signals, but he could not control the anchor that Scout provided. Elias realized that the fog in Saltmere Cove was just another layer of the conspiracy, a social shroud meant to isolate him until he broke for good. But as long as Scout was by his side, the pieces of the fog would eventually form a map, and that map would lead him back to the truth Sarah had died to protect. He turned away from the village center and began the walk back to Tidcrest, the rusted key in his pocket feeling less like an anchor and more like a weapon. The salt air at Tidcrest had grown heavier, no longer just a scent of the sea, but a thick, oppressive weight that seemed to carry the static of 1,000 unspoken threats. Elias sat by the attic window, the rusted key resting on the sill beside a pair of vintage signal corps binoculars he had unearthed from the basement's copper-lined archives. His beige canvas jacket felt like a second skin, providing a thin layer of armor against the damp chill, while his dark charcoal chinos allowed him to vanish into the shadows of the unlit room. Below, on the gray churning waters of the Atlantic, a weathered lobster boat named the Silent Trawler bobbed with an unnatural rhythm. To a casual observer, the three men on deck were merely fishermen struggling with a stubborn haul, but Elias's hazel eyes, sharpened by decades of threat assessment, saw the truth. Their movements were too synchronized, their clean-shaven jaws too rigid, and their eyes spent more time scanning the peeling white siding of Tidcrest than the dark depths of the water. The electronic ghosts Carver had planted inside the house had failed, so the general had moved his pieces onto the board, surrounding the fortress with flesh and blood sentinels. The leader of the group was a man Elias recognized from a shadowed past, Agent Victor Vance. At 38, Vance was a surgical instrument in human form, a specialist in cleanup operations who had traded his soul for a seat at Carver's right hand. He was a man of jagged angles and predatory stillness, with a military buzz cut that revealed a thin, white scar running from his left temple down to a jawline that looked as though it were carved from cold flint. His eyes were the color of sun-bleached slate, devoid of empathy, and his hands, wrapped in tactical fingerless gloves, moved with a mechanical efficiency that betrayed his ex-contractor status. Vance didn't laugh or converse. He existed in a state of permanent, lethal readiness, a man who viewed the world through a crosshair. Beside him was a younger operative, a man Elias silently dubbed the Mechanic, who spent his time fiddling with a high-gain antenna disguised as a fishing rod. They were professionals, but they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the intelligence of the animal sitting at Elias's feet. Scout moved with a low belly crawl toward the edge of the rocky promontory, his sable fur blending perfectly with the salt and pepper granite. The dog didn't need a command. He sensed the shift in Elias's heart rate, the transition from the broken veteran of Saltmere Cove to the commander of the Signal Corps fortress. As the Silent Trawler drifted closer to a small, secluded dock Sarah had once used for her evening swims, Scout exhibited a flash of the witty brilliance that had made him a legend in their old unit. While Vance and his team were distracted by a simulated equipment malfunction Elias had triggered by tapping into the house's old external power lines, Scout slipped into the water. He swam with a silent, powerful stroke, his amber eyes fixed on the target. He didn't approach the boat like a threat. He approached like a stray, a curious animal lost in the fog. On the deck, Vance was preoccupied with a crackling radio, his back turned as he adjusted the frequency. Scout reached the low-slung side of the trawler, and with a burst of athletic grace, he hauled his wet sable frame onto the slick timber of the stern. He moved like a shadow, weaving between rusted crates of bait and coils of heavy rope. His target sat on a wooden bench near the cabin door, a military-grade encrypted walkie-talkie, left momentarily unattended as the mechanic leaned over the side of the boat to check a dummy sensor Elias had planted in the surf. Scout didn't hesitate. He grasped the radio's rubberized casing in his teeth, his jaw applying just enough pressure to hold it without triggering a distress signal. With a playful flick of his tail that mocked the agent's professional paranoia, he slid back into the freezing Atlantic, disappearing into the mist before the mechanic even stood up. Elias met Scout at the shoreline, his hands buried in the dog's thick, wet fur as he retrieved the prize. The walkie-talkie was still active, the channel open to a command center miles away. Elias retreated into the lead-line pantry, the one Sarah had reinforced to protect her delicate neurological samples, and turned the volume to a whisper. The voice that emerged from the speaker was cold, authoritative, and unmistakable. General Carver. The psychological erosion in the town is nearly complete, Carver's voice crackled, sounding like dead leaves on gravel. But Elias is recovering faster than the Riverside data predicted. If Vance can't provoke a violent lapse within the next 48 hours, we terminate the project. Tidcrest will be classified as a hazardous site, a tragic gas leak. We cannot afford him remembering the Echo 7 massacre. If he connects the neurosuppressant Sarah was developing to our field tests, the entire legacy burns. End him, Victor. Make it look like the PTSD finally took its toll. Elias felt the air in the pantry grow thin, but this time there was no panic, no gasping for air. The Echo 7 massacre was the key, the missing piece of the mosaic that Carver had tried to scrub from his mind with 3 years of white-walled treatments. He saw fragments of a burning village, not of enemies, but of civilians used as test subjects for a chemical Sarah had refused to sign off on. He remembered her face, not just the dimpled smile, but the fierce, righteous anger in her dark eyes as she handed him the rusted key and told him that the truth was buried where the stones breathe. She hadn't been silenced because of a medical accident. She had been murdered because she was the only one who could prove the military had turned its own soldiers into executioners. The revelation transformed the house. Tidcrest was no longer a decaying Victorian ruin. It was a tactical operations center. Elias looked at Scout, who was shaking the salt water from his sable coat, his amber eyes bright with a mischievous satisfaction. The dog had given him more than a radio. He had given him the initiative. The hunters on the silent trawler thought they were closing in on a wounded animal, but they were actually drifting into a kill zone prepared 80 years ago by the Signal Corps and refined today by a man with nothing left to lose. Elias adjusted his beige canvas jacket, the fabric now feeling like a combat vest, and looked at his charcoal chinos, noting the tactical silence they provided against the floorboards. The game had shifted. He spent the next hour in the basement, moving with a silent, lethal purpose. He bypassed the central hub Carver's team had installed and began activating the original Signal Corps infrastructure. He found the old U.S. Signal Corps 1944 relay station behind a false wall Sarah had hidden with a bookshelf. It was a masterpiece of analog engineering, a series of high-powered radio transmitters and a primitive but effective sonar array that used the breath of the stones, the natural resonance of the Vach jaw, to amplify signals. He could use this to jam the silent trawler's modern GPS and communication, effectively blinding Vance and his team while they were still in the treacherous waters of the cove. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the main coast in a bloody orange glow, Elias stood on the porch, Scout sitting stoically by his side. He looked out at the silent trawler, which was now struggling against a sudden, artificial fog he had generated, using the basement's ancient ventilation system. Victor Vance was on the deck, his sharkskin eyes scanning the mist, sensing for the first time that the prey had stopped running. Elias held the rusted key in his hand, feeling the power it represented. Sarah had left him a map, and Scout had given him the enemy's voice. The hunted was gone. The commander had returned, and the ghosts of Tidcrest were hungry for justice. The damp chill of the cellar floor seeped through Elias's dark charcoal chinos as he followed the rhythmic click of Scout's claws against the ancient salt-crusted stone. Outside, the Atlantic continued its relentless assault on the cliffs, but within the bowels of Tidcrest, the world felt frozen in a pre-war silence. Elias adjusted his beige canvas jacket, the weight of the stolen walkie-talkie in his pocket, a constant reminder that Victor Vance and his team were still circling the perimeter like sharks in the mist. He had spent the last hour navigating the shadows, bypassing the surveillance devices Carver had planted in the upper floors, trusting only the primal senses of the German shepherd, leading him deeper into the foundation. They bypassed the old wine racks, where the remains of Sarah's favorite vintages sat covered in a thick shroud of gray dust, and moved toward a corner where the U.S. Signal Corps 1944 etching marked the boundary of the original military bunker. Scout stopped abruptly, his sable fur illuminated by the narrow beam of Elias's flashlight, his amber eyes fixed on a specific section of the damp granite. The dog began to scratch at the surface with a frantic, purposeful intensity, his claws tracing a faint, star-shaped mark that had been carved with surgical precision into the stone. It was Sarah's private signature, a celestial breadcrumb she had left for him in a world of darkness, and as Elias pressed his fingers against the cold star, he felt a mechanical click resonate through the floorboards. A section of the foundation wall groaned, pivoting on hidden oiled hinges to reveal a passage that smelled of ozone and preserved parchment. As they stepped inside, the lights, ancient but functional Signal Corps emergency lamps, flickered to life, bathing the room in a pale amber glow. This was Sarah's true sanctuary, a laboratory shielded by copper mesh and lead that Carver's modern sensors had never been able to penetrate. In the center of the room sat a desk covered in neurological charts and military dossiers, all bearing the emblem of Project Minimosin, Carver's secret memory erasure program. On top of the files sat a small bundle wrapped in faded blue silk. Elias's hands trembled as he unwrapped it to reveal his old harmonica, the metal polished and gleaming as if it had been played only yesterday. As he touched the cold steel, a fragment of memory shattered the haze in his mind. The sound of this very harmonica playing a lonely melody as his unit huddled in a cold trench, moments before the betrayal that had claimed their lives. Among the documents, Elias found a personnel file for a man he hadn't thought of in years, Major Julian Voss. The photograph showed a man in his early 50s, with a face that looked as though it had been forged in the fires of an artillery strike. Rugged, with a deep-set scowl and a thick iron-gray mustache that obscured a mouth that rarely smiled. Voss had been the unit's logistics officer, a man of rigid integrity who had often clashed with Carver's flexible ethics. Beside the file was a handwritten note from Sarah, her elegant script a painful contrast to the harsh military jargon surrounding it. She described Voss as the first subject, the man whose brain had been the primary canvas for Carver's early field tests of the neurosuppressant. Sarah's skin had been pale with exhaustion when she wrote these entries, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, as she realized that her own research into treating trauma was being weaponized to erase the very crimes she was trying to heal. She had been Sarah the neurologist, tall and slender, with a mind like a diamond, but she had died as Sarah the whistleblower, the woman who knew that 1,095 days of Elias's treatment were never meant to fix him, but to bury the Echo 7 massacre forever. Also present in the files was a reference to Dr. Henry Chen, a man Sarah had described as her only ally within the Riverside medical infrastructure. Chen was a man of 60, with thick round spectacles that magnified eyes perpetually filled with a nervous academic curiosity. He was a small, stooped man who wore lab coats 3 sizes too large, his pockets always stuffed with pens and digital storage drives. He was a master of data encryption, a man who believed that information was a sacred trust. And Sarah's logs revealed that he had been the one to help her smuggle the Signal Corps equipment into Tidcrest under the guise of home renovations. Chen's fate remained unknown, but his contributions were everywhere. The oiled locks, the hidden power relays, and the encrypted feedback loops that had kept Carver at bay for 3 years. Elias looked at the pile of evidence and realized the magnitude of the lie. He hadn't been a patient. He had been a biological hard drive that Carver was trying to reformat, a commander whose memory was the only thing standing between the general and a congressional investigation. Scout let out a low, mournful whimper and lay down beside the desk, his head resting on his paws as his amber eyes followed Elias's every move. The dog's posture was one of profound understanding, as if he possessed the very memories Elias was currently retrieving from the shadows. Scout had been the silent sentinel during Sarah's final months, the one who had watched her carve the star into the wall and seen her wrap the harmonica in silk as the walls of the conspiracy closed in. The dog's amber eyes were heavy with a sadness that mirrored the hollow ache in Elias's chest, a grief for the unit they had lost, the wife who had been stolen, and the 3 years of life that had been replaced by a white-walled nightmare. Scout wasn't just a partner anymore. He was the keeper of the truth, the only living creature that knew the history Elias had been forbidden to remember. Elias picked up the harmonica and blew a single soft note, the sound echoing through the lead-lined bunker like a ghost calling from the past. The realization of the betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow. Carver hadn't just allowed the Echo 7 massacre to happen. He had engineered it as a stress test for his new neuroagents. Elias had been the sole survivor not by luck, but by design. He was the ultimate test subject, a man whose elite training would prove the drug's effectiveness in even the most resilient minds. The beige canvas jacket he wore felt like a shroud, and the charcoal chinos felt like the heavy gray weight of a prison. He was only just beginning to escape. He looked at the dossiers, the stars on the wall, and the loyal animal at his feet, and the magnitude of the truth began to play in his mind with a lethal, crystalline clarity. As the walkie-talkie in his pocket crackled with Victor Vance's rigid mechanical voice, Elias didn't flinch. He knew their plan now. He knew that the gas leak Carver intended was meant to destroy this very room and every shred of Sarah's legacy. He looked at Scout, and for the first time in 3 years, the hazel of his eyes wasn't clouded by trauma. It was bright with a commander's fire. He began to gather the files, tucking the silk-wrapped harmonica into the deep pocket of his jacket, next to the rusted key that had, Kwa Kung, unlocked the door to his own soul. The hunted was no longer just surviving. He was arming himself with the truth, and the ghosts of Tidcrest were finally ready to march. He gave Scout a sharp, silent command, and the German shepherd stood, his sable frame tensed for the battle that lay ahead. The basement was no longer a tomb. It was the birth of a revolution. The transformation of Tidcrest did not happen with a grand, sweeping gesture, but with the quiet, lethal precision of a commander reclaiming his battlefield. The Victorian ruin, once a symbol of Elias's decay, began to breathe again, but its new rhythm was mechanical, cold, and calculated. Elias moved through the shadows of the upper floors, his beige canvas jacket now a tactical shroud that brushed against the peeling wallpaper as he rewired the house's skeletal remains. He worked in a state of hyper-focus, his hazel eyes no longer clouded by the ghosts of Riverside, but sharpened into flint-like points of observation. The dark charcoal chinos he wore blended into the silhouettes of the hallways, making him a ghost in his own home, a man who had reclaimed the architecture of his past to weaponize his future. Outside, the Atlantic roared against the jagged promontory, a chaotic symphony that Elias used to mask the metallic clinking of his work. Every floorboard that creaked was either silenced with a hidden brace or intentionally loosened to serve as an acoustic tripwire. Tidcrest was no longer a place of memories. It was a living trap, a signal corps fortress reborn to protect the truth Sarah had left behind. In the lead-lined sanctuary of the basement, Elias began the most critical phase of the fortification, the sensory integration of Scout. He used the original 1944 signal corps oscillators, repaired with parts scavenged from Sarah's lab, to generate high-frequency pulses that mirrored the signature of Carver's modern surveillance drones. Scout sat stoically in the center of the copper mesh room, his sable fur illuminated by the amber glow of vacuum tubes. His amber eyes locked on Elias with a terrifying intelligence. Elias would trigger a microburst of sound, a frequency far above the threshold of human hearing, and Scout would respond with a low, subvocal vibration, a growl so deep it was felt in the marrow rather than heard by the ear. This was the biological alarm of a specialized recon asset. The dog learned to distinguish the hum of a distant satellite link from the natural white noise of the ocean, turning his ears into high-gain antennas that could map the invisible web Carver was weaving around the house. While Scout mastered the electronic battlefield, Elias turned his attention to the physical perimeter. He utilized the rusted remnants of the coastal defense systems, turning old winch cables and iron debris into a series of non-lethal but debilitating mechanical traps. Along the salt-slicked cliffs, he installed tripwires made of high-tensile fishing line that, when triggered, would release counterweighted boulders or swing heavy lobster crate frames to block the narrow ascent paths. He worked with a grim satisfaction, his hands calloused and stained with the grease of ancient machinery. He remembered Sarah's dimpled smile and how she once said that the stones of the coast were the guardians of their secrets. Now, those stones were being literalized into a defense network. He rigged the old signal corps sonar buoys to vibrate against the foundation, creating a low-frequency hum that would interfere with any thermal imaging devices Vance's team might try to point at the windows. The house was becoming a vacuum in the middle of a digital storm. A new silhouette appeared on the digital monitoring screens Elias had slaved to the basement's analog relay. Marcus Thorne, a distant cousin of Silas and a specialized tracker hired by Carver, had arrived to reinforce the encroaching hunters. Marcus was a man in his late 50s, a former park ranger who had spent too much time in the dark corners of the world. He was a predator in a flannel shirt, his frame long and gaunt like a winter-starved wolf. His face was a map of deep-set wrinkles and scars, with a hooked nose and a thin, cruel mouth that seemed perpetually stained with tobacco. Unlike the clean-shaven agents on the boat, Marcus moved with a hunched, uneven gait that hit a surprising speed. His eyes, dull and gray like wet slate, constantly searching the grass for the displacement of a single blade. He was a man of the earth, a hunter who didn't rely on technology but on the language of the trail, making him the most dangerous threat to Elias's perimeter. He didn't carry a radio. He carried a heavy, serrated hunting knife and a silence that felt heavier than the fog. As Marcus Thorne began his initial probe of the lower cliffs, Scout took his position on the wraparound porch, his body a shadow against the peeling white wood. He wasn't just watching. He was listening to the very air. Through the training Elias had provided, the dog could sense the minute pressure changes caused by a human moving through the dense Maine fog. When Marcus stepped onto a patch of gravel 200 yards away, Scout didn't bark. He let out a sharp, single pulse, a tactical vibration that Elias received through the conductive copper wiring he had wrapped around the staircase banisters. It was a perfect fusion of commanded intellect and animal instinct. Elias, sitting in the lid-lined pantry, felt the banister vibrate under his hand and knew exactly which sector Marcus was testing. The synergy between man and dog had reached a level of peak performance that transcended mere partnership. They were two parts of a single, lethal system. Elias watched Marcus through a pinhole camera he had mounted inside an old weather vane. He saw the hunter stop, tilt his head, and sniff the air, his gray eyes narrowing as he sensed the wrongness of the house's silence. Marcus was used to prey that ran, prey that left a trail of fear. But Tidcrest felt like an empty shell, a hollow tomb that gave back nothing but the sound of the waves. This was the psychological game Elias had intended. He wanted them to feel the isolation, to doubt their sensors, to believe that the veteran they were hunting was nothing more than a ghost lost in his own trauma. He adjusted the beige canvas jacket, feeling the harmonica in his pocket as a reminder of the melody he was about to play for them. The agents Carver had sent were failing because they were looking for a victim, and they hadn't realized that the commander had already occupied the high ground. Inside the bunker, Elias fine-tuned the resonance of the signal core oscillators. He set them to trigger a dissonant, high-pitched squeal if any unauthorized wireless signal was detected within the house's copper mesh shield. This would not only alert Scout, but would also physically disorient any operative wearing a standard-issue tactical headset. Scout moved back into the cellar, taking his place beside Sarah's star-marked stone, his amber eyes never leaving the doorway. The dog's posture was one of absolute vigilance, his breathing synchronized with the low hum of the vacuum tubes. He understood that the fortress was not just a place of wood and stone, but a promise made 1,095 days ago, a Da Nguyen that required them to be more than just survivors. They were the guardians of the truth, and the foundation of Tidcrest was now a fortress of justice. As the night deepened and the fog turned into a solid, impenetrable wall, Elias sat on the cellar floor and shared a final, quiet moment with his partner. He fed Scout a strip of dried meat, his hand lingering on the dog's broad, sable head. "We're ready, Scout," he whispered, his voice a low rasp that held no fear, only the cold certainty of a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to fight back. The walkie-talkie in his pocket remained silent, a sign that Vance and Marcus were regrouping for their final push. Elias looked at the signal core mark and then at the rusted key, which now hung on a cord around his neck like a medal of valor. The hunted had completed the transformation into the Tho San. The fortress was armed, the Scout was on point, and the symphony of truth was about to reach its first explosive movement. The moon was a pale, jagged sliver, struggling to pierce through the unnatural, thick fog that Elias had conjured from the depths of Tidcrest's ancient ventilation systems, turning the rocky promontory into a landscape of shifting shadows. Inside the lead-lined pantry, the air was cold and still, smelling of the dry silk that had protected the harmonica for 3 long years. Elias sat on a wooden crate, his dark charcoal chinos blending into the floor's deep shadows, while his beige canvas jacket provided a thin barrier against the encroaching dampness. He looked at Scout, who sat perfectly still in the center of the room, his sable fur illuminated by the orange glow of the 1944 Signal Corps vacuum tubes. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on the silver instrument in Elias's hand, his ears twitching as if he could already hear the melody Elias was about to unleash. Outside, the atmosphere was thick with the silent, predatory presence of Victor Vance and Marcus Thorne. But a third force had now joined the circle. Captain Gideon the Butcher Cross. Cross was a man of 60, a veteran of the same Black Ops circles as General Carver, but with a soul that had long since been charred by the fires of war. He was a massive man, standing 6'4" with a chest like an iron boiler and arms covered in faded blue-ink tattoos of serpents and bayonets. His face was a fortress of scarred tissue, with a broken nose that leaned to the left and eyes like cold, bottomless pits of obsidian. He wore a heavy midnight blue tactical coat and moved with a heavy, deliberate gait that suggested a man who didn't fear death because he had lived in its company for decades. Cross didn't believe in this psychological erosion Vance had attempted. He believed in the total annihilation of the target's spirit before the final strike. Elias raised the harmonica to his lips, the cold metal tasting of salt and the blood of the Echo 7 unit. He didn't start with a flourish. He began with a low, mournful drone, the D note that had always heralded the beginning of the unit's marching song. As he blew, he activated the basement's original Signal Corps relay station, slaving the output to the external sonar buoys he had rigged into the Vach jaw. The sound didn't just play, it broadcasted. It caught the natural resonance of the hollowed-out granite, the breath of the stones that Sarah had always marveled at, and amplified the melody until the entire promontory began to vibrate. The music was no longer just a collection of notes. It was the history of 1,095 lost days being reclaimed in a single, defiant breath. The melody was The Iron Ghost, the unit's anthem, a song that spoke of soldiers who never retreated and souls that never found rest. It was a haunting minor key march that seemed to rise not from the house, but from the very Atlantic itself. On the deck of the silent trawler, Victor Vance froze as the first notes hit the hull of the boat, the vibrations rattling the glass of his tactical displays. Beside him, the mechanic checked the sensors, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Sir, the sonar is picking up. Multiple signatures," the younger man whispered, his voice shaking. "It sounds like a choir, but there's no electronic source. It's coming from the stone itself." Marcus Thorne, standing on the lower cliffs, dropped to one knee and sniffed the air, his slate-gray eyes wide with a primal terror. He was a man of the earth, a tracker who understood the language of the trail. But this sound was the language of the grave. The music didn't just hit his ears, it hit his marrow, making him feel as though the fog around him was populated by the invisible silhouettes of the Echo 7 soldiers Elias had lost. To Marcus, the music sounded like the collective footsteps of 1,000 men marching toward the cliffs, their boots treading on the salt-slicked granite with a rhythmic, lethal intent. As the harmonica reached its crescendo, Scout threw his head back and let out a long, haunting howl, the tactical multiplier Elias had trained him for. The dog's voice was pitched perfectly to match the harmonica's frequency, creating a harmonic resonance that distorted the air. The sound was a biological scream, layered over a mechanical ghost, and the effect on the mercenaries outside was catastrophic. In the shadows near the porch, Gideon Cross felt his grip on his heavy assault rifle falter. For the first time in 40 years, the obsidian pits of his eyes flickered with a shadow of doubt. He had fought armies, he had slaughtered villages, but he had never fought a man who could summon the dead with a piece of tin and a dog. The music seemed to whisper the names of those they had betrayed at Echo 7, the names Carver had tried to erase with his Project Mnemosyne. The hunters were no longer the predators. They were intruders in a temple of memory, and the ghosts they had created were finally answering the call. Elias didn't stop. He pushed the air through the harmonica, with the force of a man who was finally breathing for himself after 3 years of suffocation. He saw Sarah's dimples smile in the amber glow of the vacuum tubes, and he felt her hand on his beige shoulder, guiding the melody toward the final movement. The rusted key around his neck vibrated against his chest, a medal of valor for a man who had survived the erasure of his soul. The psychological game had reached its peak. Outside, Vance's team began to fire blindly into the fog. their modern tactical training abandoned in the face of a psychological assault they couldn't quantify. They were shooting at shadows, at the echoes of their own guilt, while Elias and Scout sat in the heart of the Signal Corps fortress, the absolute masters of the narrative. The harmonica of the souls had completed its work. The enemy was fractured, their cohesion destroyed by a melody that shouldn't exist. Elias lowered the instrument, the final note lingering in the lid-lined room like a cold, bright star. He looked at Scout, whose amber eyes were now burning with the same commander's fire that lit the hazel depths of his own. The attack was coming, but the battle had already been won in the minds of the men outside. Tidcrest was no longer just a house. It was a legend, and the ghosts of Saltmere Cove were ready to fight. The freezing rain of the Maine coast turned the jagged granite of the cliffs into a treacherous landscape of obsidian and ice. At the summit of Mount Saltmere, a massive M800 armored mobile command vehicle sat like a predatory insect. Its hydraulic stabilizers buried deep into the soil, and its array of high-gain satellite dishes tilted toward the gray, churning sky. Inside the pressurized, climate-controlled interior, General Arthur Carver sat in a high-backed leather chair, his face illuminated by the clinical blue glow of a dozen thermal radar screens. At 65, Carver remained a man of terrifying discipline, his silver hair cropped in a perfect military buzz and his uniform so crisp it seemed carved from stone. His skin was the color of old vellum, stretched tight over a jawline that had never known the softness of mercy. He watched a pulsing red heat signature inside the mouth of the tide, a deep, echoing cave at the base of the cliffs, and a thin, cold smile touched his lips. He was the architect of shadows, the man who believed that memory was a commodity to be traded and erased. Beside him stood his chief technician, a man named Miller, whose trembling fingers danced over a console that displayed the thermal heartbeats of the hunted. Carver believed he finally had Elias trapped in a tomb of granite, surrounded by a ring of mercenaries who were closing in with the lethality of a tightening noose. But Elias was no longer the broken patient Carver had cultivated at Riverside. Deep inside the mouth of the tide, Elias adjusted his beige canvas jacket, the fabric damp and heavy with sea spray, while his dark charcoal chinos allowed him to vanish into the deep, velvet shadows of the cave. He wasn't running, he was creating a masterpiece of misdirection. He took the silk-wrapped harmonica, the soul of his unit, and tied it securely to the speaker of a portable Signal Corps radio he had salvaged from the Tidecrest bunker. He set the radio to broadcast a low-frequency rhythmic hum that mirrored the thermal signature of a human lung in distress, while the harmonica vibrated against the speaker, creating a localized acoustic ghost that bounced off the cavern walls. To Carver's thermal sensors on the mountain, it appeared as though Elias was huddled in the back of the cave, paralyzed by a PTSD episode. In reality, Elias and Scout were already outside, standing at the base of the Devil's Ladder, a vertical 500-foot cliff that Carver's mercenaries had deemed unclimbable in this weather. The climb was a brutal test of the elite training that Riverside had failed to erase. Elias hauled his lean frame up the salt-slicked granite, his fingers bleeding as they found microscopic purchase in the cracks Sarah had once described as the veins of the stone. Beside him, Scout moved with an unnatural feline agility, his sable fur blending into the rock, and his amber eyes fixed on the ledge above. The dog didn't need a leash or a command. He was the commander's silent shadow, his paws finding grip on ledges that would have sent a lesser animal plummeting into the surf. When they finally reached the summit, Elias lay flat against the freezing mud, his breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts as he watched the command vehicle. Guarding the rear hatch was Master Sergeant Silas Halloway, a man whose presence felt like a physical weight in the mist. Halloway was 52, with a face that looked as though it had been run over by a tank, flattened, scarred, and devoid of anything resembling a soul. He was a mountain of muscle wrapped in a black tactical vest, his buzz cut revealing a jagged scar that ran from his ear to the base of his skull. He held his rifle with the casual indifference of a man who had killed so many he no longer bothered to keep count. Elias gave Scout a single, sharp hand signal, the silent strike command. Scout didn't bark, he didn't growl. He launched himself from the shadows like a sable-colored thunderbolt. He hit Holloway with the full force of his 80-pound frame, his jaws clamping onto the master sergeant's forearm before the man could even raise his weapon. As Holloway gasped in pain, Elias emerged from the fog, delivering a precise, non-lethal strike to the man's temple that sent him into a silent unconsciousness. The breach was complete. Elias didn't use a key. He used the tactical override codes Dr. Henry Chen had hidden inside the Signal Corps harmonica logs. The rear hatch of the M800 hissed open, and Elias stepped into the belly of the beast, Scout sitting stoically at his heels, his amber eyes glowing with a predatory fire. Inside the command center, General Carver didn't even turn around. "Is he dead yet, Miller?" he asked, his voice dripping with the arrogance of a god. "The thermal signature is flat," Miller replied, his voice shaking. "He's gone, sir." "Not quite, General," Elias said, his voice a low, lethal rasp that seemed to freeze the very air in the cabin. Carver spun around, his silver eyes wide with the first taste of genuine fear he had felt in decades. He looked at the man standing before him, the beige jacket stained with mud, the hazel eyes bright with the light of Echo 7, and he realized that the project had not only survived, but had evolved. Scout let out a low, subvocal vibration that rattled the metal floorboards, pinning Miller to his seat with a single, amber-eyed stare. Elias didn't raise a weapon. He didn't need to. He stepped toward the primary communications console and slammed the rusted Tidcrest key into the manual override port. "I'm not here to kill you, Carver," Elias said, his hands moving over the keyboard with the speed of a man who had finally found the missing pieces of his soul. "I'm here to let the world see you." He activated the satellite broadcast system Sarah and Dr. Chen had secretly prepared, a direct, encrypted link to the Military Investigation Command's global frequency. The screens in the room shifted from thermal maps to a live, high-definition broadcast that was being beamed to every major military headquarters on the planet. "You won't do it," Carver sneered, his composure returning like a mask. "It's my word against a broken veteran." "Then tell them about Echo 7, Elias replied, his voice calm and cold. "Tell them why you murdered my unit. Tell them why you killed my wife." Carver laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I killed them because they were weak, Elias. Sarah was a genius, but she was soft. She couldn't see the necessity of the neuro-erasure program. I destroyed your unit to test the serum, and I'd do it again to ensure this country has soldiers who don't feel guilt." The general's confession, fueled by a lifetime of unchallenged hubris, echoed through the command vehicle and into the ears of the world's highest-ranking officers. He didn't realize that the satellite link was already live. He didn't see the red, on-air light pulsing on the console. Elias stepped back, his hand resting on Scout's sable head. "The Signal Corps legacy was always about the broadcast of truth, General," Elias said, the hazel of his eyes now completely clear. On the main screen, the face of a 4-star admiral appeared, his expression one of absolute, righteous fury. "General Carver," the admiral's voice boomed through the speakers. "This is the Military Investigation Command. We have your confession on a secured line. Surrender your post immediately. You are under arrest for high treason and mass murder. The mind attack was over. The hunted had become the judge, and the ghosts of Tidcrest were finally, at long as last, satisfied." The roar of the storm finally began to subside, replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thrumming of a dozen Black Hawk helicopters descending through the thinning mist like iron angels of judgment. At the summit of Mount Saltmere, the clinical blue light inside the M800 command vehicle was drowned out by the flashing crimson and sapphire strobes of a convoy of military police armored carriers that had crested the ridge with surgical precision. Elias stood in the open rear hatch, his beige canvas field jacket damp with the freezing rain of the Maine coast, and his dark charcoal chinos stained with the mud of his tactical climb. Yet, he stood with a posture of absolute, unshakable authority. Beside him, Scout remained a silent sentinel, his sable fur matted with ice, and his amber eyes fixed on the entrance of the vehicle where General Arthur Carver sat frozen in the ruins of his own hubris. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine and ozone, the atmosphere of a world that had just been purged by a flood of truth. Leading the extraction team was Colonel Gregory Sterling, a man who had spent 30 years in the shadows of the Military Investigation Command. Sterling was 58, a man who looked like he had been carved from the same stubborn Maine granite as the cliffs below. He possessed a square, unyielding jaw, salt and pepper hair cut to a strict military regulation length, and eyes that held the weary but sharp clarity of a man who had seen too many generals forget their oaths. He moved with a heavy, deliberate pace, his tactical boots crunching on the gravel, and as he reached the command vehicle, he didn't look at the flickering radar screens or the satellite arrays. He looked directly at Elias, recognizing the commander who had finally returned from the erasure. "General Carver!" Sterling's voice boomed, a sound like low thunder that brooked no dissent. By order of the Joint Chiefs and based on the live broadcast transmission received at 03 hours, you are being relieved of command and placed under immediate arrest for high treason, mass murder, and the illegal conduct of Project Minimazin. The elite military police officers moved into the vehicle with practiced efficiency, their hands steady as they placed the silver-haired Carver in heavy tactical restraints. Carver, once the architect of shadows, looked small in the leather chair he had used to play God. His skin seemed to gray in the presence of the moonlight that was finally beginning to break through the clouds. As he was led past Elias, Carver stopped for a single fleeting second, his silver eyes searching Elias's hazel gaze for a hint of the broken man he had tried to create at Riverside. But he found only the iron resolve of the Echo 7 survivor, a man whose soul had been reconstructed by the very memories Carver had tried to burn away. Elias didn't say a word. He simply rested his hand on Scout's broad, sable head, the dog letting out a low, satisfied vibration that signaled the end of the hunt. The mountaintop was soon flooded with the arrival of regular Army personnel, many of whom were Elias's former peers, men who had served under him before the world collapsed 3 years ago. They gathered in a loose circle around the man and the dog, their expressions a mixture of awe and profound regret for having believed the rumors Carver had sown. Colonel Sterling stepped toward Elias, offering a formal salute that carried the weight of 1,000 apologies. "Colonel Elias, the record is being corrected as we speak. There is a transport waiting to take you to D.C. for a full debriefing and a formal ceremony. The medals of honor for your unit are being prepared." Elias looked at the soldier, then turned his gaze toward the horizon where the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the Atlantic in shades of gold and violet. He felt the silk-wrapped harmonica in the pocket of his beige jacket and the rusted Tidcrest key hanging around his neck, like a medal that no government could ever award. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want the hollow praise of a system that had allowed Sarah to be silenced. He wanted only the silence of the cliffs and the truth to stand as a monument to the men who had fallen at Echo 7. "I'm staying here, Sterling," Elias replied, his voice a low rasp that held a peace he hadn't known in 1,095 days. "My unit has their peace now. Sarah has her voice back. That's all the medals I need." Scout watched as the convoy of armored vehicles began its descent down the mountain, the red tail lights disappearing into the fog like fading embers. The dog sat by Elias's boots, his amber eyes calm and reflective, mirroring the silver moonlight that now bathed the entire coast. He gave a single gentle wag of his tail, a gesture that seemed to dismiss the years of pain, the electronic ghosts, and the white-walled nightmare of Riverside. It was a goodbye to the struggle and a greeting to the quiet life that Sarah had always envisioned for them at Tidcrest. Elias stood on the rocky promontory, a fit middle-aged veteran of 45, whose hazel eyes were now bright, with a clarity that surpassed the vision of any radar. He knew the symphony of truth was finally complete. He reached down and unclipped the tactical harness he had fashioned for Scout, letting the dog breathe the free air of the Maine coast without the weight of duty. Together, they walked away from the command vehicle and toward the Signal Corps fortress that had stood as their only true ally. As the moon hung high above Tidcrest, the ghosts of the past were finally replaced by the living breath of the ocean, and the commander was finally, truly, at home. The salt air of the Maine coast no longer carried the static of electronic ghosts or the oppressive weight of a hunter's gaze. Instead, it arrived at the cliffs of Tidcrest, smelling of freshly mown grass, blooming lilacs, and the warm, yeasty scent of Margaret Brennan's blackberry pies. 1 year had passed since the satellite broadcast from the M800 command vehicle had shattered General Carver's empire of shadows, and the transformation of the Victorian house was nothing short of a biological miracle. The white wooden siding, once peeling like skeletal fingers, was now freshly painted and gleaming under the golden Maine sun, its windows no longer watchful eyes, but portals for the morning light to flood the rooms where Sarah had once dreamt of healing. The U.S. A Signal Corps, 1944. Mark in the foundation remained, but it was no longer a hidden map for a fugitive. It was the cornerstone of the Scout Academy, a sanctuary where the echoes of war were systematically replaced by the rhythmic thumping of tails and the steady grounding presence of four-legged healers. Elias stood on the wraparound porch, a fit 46-year-old veteran whose hazel eyes were now bright with a calm clarity that surpassed the vision of any radar. His hair, once a solid chestnut, was now predominantly silver at the temples, and his neatly groomed beard held the same distinguished flex, contouring a face that had finally shed the weathered angles of trauma for the soft lines of purpose. He was dressed in his signature utilitarian palette, a clean beige canvas field jacket worn over a crisp beige button-up shirt, and solid dark charcoal chino pants that broke perfectly over his polished brown boots. In his hand, he held not a weapon or a stolen radio, but a wooden whistle carved from the driftwood of Saltmere Cove. Beside him, Scout sat with a raw dignity that defied his years, his sable coat thick and healthy, and his amber eyes reflecting the gold of the morning tide. He wore no tactical harness or lead-lined protection. He was the dean of the academy, the silent professor of unconditional loyalty. The academy thrived on the substantial restitution funds awarded by the military tribunal, money that Carver had hoarded while erasing lives, now repurposed to rebuild them. In the yard below, where the mercenaries had once prowled through the mist, a group of veterans now moved through a series of tactical bonding exercises with their new partners. Among them was Jackson Jax Miller, a young man of 32 who had served as a combat engineer before a roadside IED claimed his left leg and his sense of belonging. Jax was a man of rugged, handsome features, with a thick brown beard and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He walked with a slight, rhythmic hitch in his gait from his prosthetic, but his focus was entirely on Beacon, a 2-year-old golden retriever with fur the color of ripened wheat. Beacon was a failed seeing-eye dog who was far too affectionate for strict guide work, but was perfect for the deep pressure therapy Elias taught. Jax, who used to wake up screaming from nightmares of falling bridges, now found his anchor in the warm, solid weight of Beacon's head resting on his charcoal-clad lap. Margaret Brennan arrived as she always did at 10 in the morning, her silver hair pulled back into her practical bun, but her pale blue eyes were now dancing with a joy that Saltmere Cove hadn't seen in decades. She carried a basket of warm scones and a jar of homemade strawberry jam, the scent of her kindness trailing behind her like a familiar melody. "He's teaching them the breath of the stones, Margaret," Elias said, nodding toward Jax and Beacon. Margaret smiled, her face a map of 70 years of coastal strength. Sarah would have loved this, Elias. She always knew this house was meant to be a lighthouse, not a tomb. She set the basket on the porch table, right next to where the rusted Tidcrest key now sat in a small glass display case, a relic of a door that was now permanently open to the world. As the morning progressed, the sound of a bicycle bell announced the arrival of the village children. Leading the pack was Leo, the 14-year-old grandson of Silas Thorne. Leo was a spindly boy with a mop of sandy hair and the same flinty gray eyes as his grandfather, but his expression was one of eager curiosity rather than suspicion. Beside him was Lily Thorne, who at 15 had shed her oversized yellow raincoat for a bright blue sundress, though she still carried her sketchbook everywhere. She was no longer the quiet one who hid in the shadows. She had become the Academy's unofficial illustrator, capturing the moments of healing in the charcoal and graphite. The children gathered around Elias on the porch steps, their eyes wide as they waited for another story of the Commander and the Sable Shadow. Elias didn't tell them of the Echo 7 massacre or the electronic ghosts. He told them of the Signal Corps of 1944, of the men and women who used radio waves to bring lost ships home, and how every signal sent into the dark eventually finds a listener. The children listened in a trance, their hands buried in the soft fur of the trainee dogs who lounged at their feet. Even Silas Thorne, the once hostile gatekeeper of the village, would occasionally stop by with his truck to drop off fresh lobster for the veterans' dinner, his flinty gaze softened by the sight of his grandchildren thriving in the shadow of Tidcrest. The village had moved from shunning the unstable veteran to embracing the healer on the cliff, a communal reconciliation that felt as bracing as the Maine wind. The fog of rumors had been replaced by a transparent honesty that allowed the community to breathe again. In the final hour of the afternoon, when the veterans had retreated to their quarters and the children had cycled back to the cove, Elias sat in the center of a small garden Sarah had once tried to plant. The soil was no longer sour with neglect. It was rich and fragrant with rows of deep purple lilacs, a gift from the neighbors of Saltmere Cove who had come to plant them by hand as a gesture of peace. Elias took his old harmonica from the pocket of his beige jacket, the metal gleaming like a star in the fading light. He didn't play The Iron Ghost or A Call to War. He played a soft, wandering lullaby, a melody of growth, of quiet mornings, and of love that survives the erasure of time. Scout lay at his feet, his massive sable frame relaxed among the blooming lilacs, his amber eyes half closed in a state of absolute contentment. The dog's tail gave a slow, rhythmic wag, brushing against the flowers and releasing their sweet, heavy perfume into the air. The Symphony of Truth had reached its final, most beautiful movement. Not a broadcast of betrayal, but a song of a home reclaimed. After 3 years of storm and shadow, the Vach Ja cliff of Tidcrest was no longer a place of deathly parting. It was a sanctuary of kinship, a monument to the fact that no matter how deep the erasure, the heart always remembers the way back to the light. Elias lowered the harmonica, the final note lingering in the air, until it was swallowed by the gentle, eternal breath of the ocean, and for the first time in 1,095 days, the commander knew he was truly, finally home. The journey of Elias and Scout stands as a profound testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the unbreakable bonds of loyalty. From the cold, sterile halls of Riverside to the sun-drenched lilac gardens of the Scout Academy, they prove that healing is not a solitary destination, but a shared path. It often takes a faithful heart, one with 4 paws and amber eyes, to bridge the gap between a shattered past and a hopeful future. The storms of life may strip away our titles, our health, or even our memories, but they can never touch the core of a soul anchored in truth and kinship. Tidcrest is no longer a place of shadows. It is a monument to the fact that when we stand together, the darkness must eventually give way to the dawn. Every act of kindness, every gentle wag of a tail, and every peaceful breath taken in nature is a small miracle granted to us by the grace of God. In our most difficult moments, we may feel abandoned, yet the Almighty often sends us silent angels in the form of loyal companions like Scout to guide us back to the light. God does not always answer us in thunderous proclamations. Sometimes he speaks through the great silence of the ocean and the unwavering devotion of the creatures who walk beside us, reminding us that we are never truly alone in our battles. In your daily life, I encourage you to seek out your own signal station of hope. Reach out to your community, embrace the healing power of nature, and never underestimate the impact of a single, honest connection. If the story of Elias and Scout has touched your heart today, please share it with someone who might need a miracle of their own. We invite you to subscribe to join our community and leave a comment below with the words truth and healing to let us know you were here. May God bless you with peace, strength, and the warmth of His love. May your heart always find its way back home to the quiet lilacs and the safety of His grace. Amen.